Hey y'all, it's entry number 42 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Josh Jacobs, running back, Las Vegas Raiders. We'll start with the positives with Josh Jacobs' fantasy profile. Rushing talent. During the 2021 season, Josh Jacobs evaded 76 tackles, the 7th best among running backs, and had 767 yards created, the 9th best among running backs, according to Player Profiler. He also broke 20 tackles, tied for the 6th best in the league, according to Pro Football Reference, and posted a broken tackle percentage of 19.4%, which is above average according to RotoWire. The next thing I really like about Josh Jacobs' fantasy profile is his touchdowns and red zone usage. Over the course of his 43-game career, Josh Jacobs has scored 28 rushing touchdowns according to Pro Football Reference. He had 42 red zone rushing attempts in 2019, the 7th best in the NFL, 66 red zone rushing attempts in 2020, the 2nd best in the NFL, and 31 red zone rushing attempts in 2021, the 18th best in the league according to NFL Savant. Seeing a lot of red zone touches and scoring touchdowns gives Jacobs a solid fantasy ceiling. The third thing I really like about Josh Jacobs' fantasy profile is that he's a capable pass catcher. Josh Jacobs has improved his receiving numbers in every season that he's been in the NFL. As a rookie in 2019, he had 20 receptions on 27 targets for 166 receiving yards. As a sophomore in 2020, he had 33 receptions on 45 targets for 238 receiving yards. And as a junior in 2021, he had 54 receptions on 64 targets for 348 receiving yards, according to Pro Football Reference. We talk about it constantly in this series, but dual threat backs are generally very valuable in fantasy leagues. So, if Jacobs can continue to get utilized in both the ground game and through the air, it gives him a nice fantasy ceiling. Moving on to some of the concerns with Josh Jacobs' fantasy profile. New running backs to eat into his workload. The Raiders will have new competition at the running back position with 4th round pick Zamir White and free agent pickup Brandon Bolden. While Josh Jacobs will certainly be the lead back, adding these players to a backfield that Jacobs already had to share with Kenyon Drake makes it likely that we see a slight dip in Jacobs' workload in 2022. The next concern I have with this profile is his offensive line. At the end of the 2021 season, the Las Vegas Raiders' offensive line ranked 28th in the league according to Pro Football Focus. They will have 3 of the same starters from the 2021 season: left tackle Colton Miller, center Andre James, and right guard Alex Leatherwood, who will move to right tackle in 2022. And the 2 new starters will be left guard Denzel Good and right guard Dylan Parham. Going into the 2022 season, the line is projected to be bad again, and they are ranked 29th according to Pro Football Focus. By having a subpar offensive line, it will be more difficult for Jacobs to be efficient. The last concern I have with this profile is that he's got a new coaching staff. This one could easily turn out to be a non-concern or even a positive, but because I've seen this frequently featured as a concern for Jacobs in 2022, we will address the coaching staff in this section. The Raiders made the decision to switch up their coaching staff this past offseason after the John Gruden fiasco last year and hired Josh McDaniels to be the new head coach and play caller. McDaniels has done a solid job of utilizing and getting production out of his whole running back room over the course of his career, but has been more of a mixed bag between going running back by committee and taking a bell cow approach. If McDaniels does indeed go with more of a running back by committee approach, it would obviously hurt Jacobs' value in fantasy leagues. Some additional thoughts on Josh Jacobs. In 2021, Josh Jacobs was RB16 in standard with 172.0 total fantasy points and 11.5 fantasy points per game, RB14 in half PPR formats with 199.0 total fantasy points and 13.3 fantasy points per game, and the RB12 in full PPR formats with 226.0 total fantasy points and 15.1 fantasy points per game, according to Fantasy Pros. During the 2021 season, in half PPR formats, Josh Jacobs had 0 out of 15 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 4 out of 15 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 6 out of 15 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 4 out of 15 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, and 1 out of 15 games with over 20 fantasy points according to fantasy data. In 2020, Josh Jacobs was the RB8 in standard with 198.3 total fantasy points and 13.2 fantasy points per game, the RB8 in half PPR formats with 214.8 total fantasy points and 14.3 fantasy points per game, and the RB8 in full PPR formats with 231.3 total fantasy points and 15.4 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. Personal opinion: Josh Jacobs is currently going off the board as RB19 about pick 46 overall on ESPN and RB21 about pick 43 overall on Yahoo. This seems the appropriate range for him going into 2022, maybe slightly too low. I think he's a solid player. He's been a low-end RB1, high-end RB2 the past couple of seasons, but there are other running backs that I feel have more upside that can make it difficult to move him higher than his current ranking. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. Josh Jacobs has been partnered with First Place for Youth to help bring additional resources and his first-hand experience and journey to the organization and its participants. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.